The Battle of Midway, fought on the 4th of June, 1942, was one of the most decisive of the Second World War in the Pacific theater of operations. This monumental naval clash between 4 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy and 3 from the United States Fleet not only had tremendous strategic implications for the immediate development of the conflict, but also, as a result of pure chance, changed nothing less than the course of history in the 20th century, Japan's plan. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese Empire demonstrated itself as an invincible power that had defeated numerous armies and sunk many fleets of the Western Allies, while its troops had conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, Wake Island, Guam Island, the Solomon Islands, and the Gilbert Islands. This aura of invulnerability was further reinforced with the recent tactical victory in the Battle of the Coral Sea, where at the cost of losing the small aircraft carrier Shoho, the Japanese, on the contrary, sank the heavy American aircraft carrier USS Lexington. However, things suddenly took a turn on the 18th of April, 1942, when the capital Tokyo was bombed by 16 B-25 Mitchell planes launched from the American aircraft carrier USS Hornet in an episode known as the Doolittle Raid, named after the mission's colonel, James Doolittle. What happened during the Doolittle Raid had unexpected consequences for the course of the Pacific War because Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was urgently summoned by the Imperial General Staff to assess the origin of the bombers. As expected, most of the high Japanese command did not believe it possible that the B-25 Mitchells had taken off from the deck of an aircraft carrier, so they erroneously thought that they must have departed from Midway Atoll to the west of the Hawaiian Islands. Based on this mistaken deduction, and the fact that Yamamoto had long been pressing to seek a decisive battle against the Americans in the Central Pacific, he finally obtained authorization from his superiors to launch the conquest of Midway. Under the name Operation MI, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto devised the most complex and ambitious plan put into practice to date by the Naval Air Force, the Kido Butai, as he divided his forces between the Central Pacific and the Northern Pacific. In the case of the latter sector, a secondary offensive called Operation AL was activated, which consisted of disabling the Dutch Harbor Naval Base in Alaska and conquering the islands of Attu, Kiska, and Adak in the Aleutian Islands. Although this would be a parallel and completely independent campaign, it would indirectly affect the bulk of the squadron destined to conquer Midway Atoll, since Yamamoto detached the 2 aircraft carriers Ryujo and Junyo, which would have been much better suited for Operation MI. Operation MI was based on the assumption that by the 3rd or 4th of June, 1942, there would be no enemy naval units at Midway Atoll. So the plan was to bomb the base and immediately thereafter land troops in the enclave. Once the garrison was reduced, engineering teams would be deployed to build a runway in less than 48 hours and defend against possible bombings coming from the Hawaiian Islands. At the same time, on the 5th day, troops would land on the nearby Kure Atoll to install a seaplane dock, which would extend the reconnaissance flight radius by another 90 kilometers. After completing this phase of the mission, it was expected that the American aircraft carriers would arrive on the 7th of June, at which moment the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu would ambush them from the northwest of the island and sink them, while Yamamoto's main force, situated 952 kilometers away, with the aircraft carrier Hosho and the three battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu, would intervene in case of complications or finish off the surviving units in a direct clash of decisive battle. On the 28th of May, 1942, the Japanese combined fleet set sail from the islands of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku in three immense naval squadrons, which only met in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the last days of the month, excluding a fourth squadron that headed north towards the Aleutian Islands. The main force, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was composed of the super battleship Yamato. As flagship, which at that time was the largest in the world, followed by the two battleships Nagato and Mutsu, the three light aircraft carriers Hosho, Chiyoda, and Nishin, and 11 destroyers, while the second-line support squadron under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo was made up of the aircraft carrier Zuiho, the two battleships Kongo and Hiei, 4 heavy cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Regarding the vanguard naval air force, the Kido Butai, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, it included the 4 heavy aircraft carriers Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu, with 272 aircraft among Zero fighters, Aichi Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, as well as the 2 battleships Haruna and Kirishima, the cruisers Tone and Chikuma, 13 escort destroyers, and 18 transports with the 5,000 troops who were to land on Midway under the leadership of Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled a total of 134 ships to invade Midway Atoll, including 8 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 10 cruisers, 43 destroyers, 22 submarines, 4 minesweepers, 3 submarine chasers, 1 patrol boat, 3 seaplane carriers, 7 oilers, 8 cargo ships, and 18 transports, plus 167 aircraft, including 93 fighters, 72 dive bombers, and 83 torpedo bombers. United States Plan. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which ended with the sinking of the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, was a severe blow to the United States fleet, although at least during the encounter, the Americans confirmed suspicions that the message decoding system they had been intercepting from the Japanese for some time through the Purple Code was apparently accurate and provided quite truthful and detailed information about the situation. Thanks to this, the cryptanalyst Joseph Rochefort from the Hypo station in Hawaii, suspecting that the enemy's next move would be Midway after hearing a message under the AF code, then sent himself a text with the same code stating that Midway's water purifier was broken and needed repair, something that was obviously false. Surprisingly, the Japanese radio operators, believing that no one was on the other end of the line, forwarded the message back to the command post on the bridge of the battleship Yamato with the words, "The water purifier of AF is broken." Upon this discovery, the Pacific Fleet Command, CNCPAC, was immediately informed, indicating that the letters AF referred to Midway, obviously the place where Yamamoto's attack would take place. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who held the leadership of the Pacific Fleet and who until then had thought the Japanese next move would be the invasion of the Hawaiian Islands, learned thanks to the Hypo station that the real point of attack would be Midway Atoll. The only problem was that at Pearl Harbor he had only the 2 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, an insufficient number to face the Kido Butai. So he had to speed up the repair of the damage suffered by the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. The way to do this was to work around the clock day and night on the ship, mobilizing 2,000 extra workers from the workshops who did not comply with the schedules established by law nor with safety standards, but whose voluntary sacrifice served so that the 3 months of planned repairs were reduced to just 3 days when the USS Yorktown was ready and patched to enter action again. Unlike Operation MI, Admiral Chester Nimitz's plan was very simple because he only organized 2 squadrons that set sail from the island of Oahu on the 28th of May, 1942. These were the 16th Task Force under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, replacing the ill Rear Admiral William Halsey, which included the 2 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, as well as the 17th Task Force under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, which had the newly repaired aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. Between the 2 formations, they had 204 planes, including 79 Wildcat fighters, 83 Dauntless SBD, Douglas dive bombers, and 42 Devastator torpedo bombers, which reached the waters of Midway Island without incident in the first days of June. Midway Atoll consisted of 2 islets of 5 square kilometers, surrounded by a solitary coral reef, whose surface was only covered by some bluish thistles and inhabited by very noisy native birds. Although located 2,100 kilometers from Pearl Harbor, the United States annexed the enclave in 1867 and established a base in 1941, building a runway 1,600 meters long and other smaller secondary runways, as well as installing underground a munitions room, a hospital, a power plant, a water purifier, and numerous fuel depots. To this infrastructure was added a Marine Corps garrison led by Colonel Harold Shannon and several squadrons with a total of 119 aircraft, including 38 PBY Catalina seaplanes, 27 Buffalo or P-40 Warhawk fighters, 27 Dauntless SBD, Douglas or Vindicator dive bombers, 17 B-17 heavy bombers, 6 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers. Admiral Chester Nimitz's strategy presented no difficulty compared to that of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, as its sole purpose was to defend Midway Atoll as long as possible and inflict the greatest possible losses on the enemy before withdrawing back to the Hawaiian Islands. The ambush would take place 600 kilometers northwest of Midway, with the 16th Task Force slightly above the 17th Task Force, but both oriented towards Point Luck, where the combined fleet was supposedly going to pass. Curiously, Nimitz's words to his men before starting the battle were, "Defend Midway and inflict the greatest possible losses on the enemy." The United States fleet assembled 49 ships, including 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 20 submarines, plus 323 aircraft, including 106 fighters, 110 dive bombers, 48 torpedo bombers, 21 bombers, and 38 seaplanes. Bombing of Midway Island. At 4:30 in the early morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the combined fleet positioned itself very close to the perimeter of Midway Atoll when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered 7 reconnaissance planes to take off. These planes were to scout 7 maritime sectors of 20 degrees each, where there was a possibility that the United States fleet was lurking. The aircraft the Japanese put in the air were two Nakajima B-5N from the aircraft carriers Kaga and Akagi, two Mitsubishi F-1M seaplanes catapulted from the cruiser Chikuma, one of the same model from the battleship Haruna, and two more from the cruiser Tone. Unfortunately, one of the Mitsubishi F-1M seaplanes from this last ship suffered a mechanical failure on the catapult, which required a half-hour repair by the operators, something that, without anyone knowing it yet, would have disastrous consequences for the Japanese, as precisely on the route of the 7th seaplane was where the 17th Task Force of the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown was located. Simultaneously, a total of 11 PBY Catalina seaplanes took off from Midway Island, scouting an area of 700 nautical miles west of the atoll. They discovered a Japanese force, which they mistakenly identified as the main body, so they immediately sent a squadron of 9 4-engine B-17s. The bombs from the flying fortresses missed because they only created geysers around the ships, although if they had hit, the losses would not have been severe since the convoy was actually the transport squadron under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, which did not include any aircraft carriers. At dawn on that 4th of June, 1942, the United States fleet, having moved its aircraft carriers about 200 nautical miles from Midway Atoll, launched several Dauntless SBD dive bombers to scout another 100 nautical miles from east to west. Soon after, 2 more PBY Catalina seaplanes from the island joined them. These flights occurred simultaneously, as from the 4 aircraft carriers of the combined fleet, a total of 108 planes took off heading towards Midway, including 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters commanded by Flight Officer Joichi Tominaga. At 5:20 in the morning, a PBY Catalina reconnaissance seaplane first sighted the main force of the Kido Butai under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Information confirmed at 5:30 by a second plane that detected on its radar a formation of enemy planes 333 kilometers away on a heading of 320 degrees. Although a group of Zero fighters tried to shoot down one of the PBY Catalinas with bursts of gunfire, the pilot was skillful enough to evade his pursuers in a cloud and transmit the message, which was received a few minutes later by Admiral Chester Nimitz, undoubtedly confirming all the reports from previous days provided by the Haipo station in Hawaii. Thanks to this cascade of valuable data, and as at 5:53, the radars indicated the presence of about 100 enemy aircraft at 172 kilometers and at an altitude of 3,700 meters, the Marines took combat positions at all facilities, and the aircraft present on the ground were ordered to take off, including 26 Breaster Buffalo and Wildcat fighters, as well as several B-17 bombers. Bombing of Midway Atoll. At 6:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, Japanese aviation appeared over Midway Atoll, engaging in an intense aerial battle against the American fighters that ended in disaster for the defenders. Thanks to the superiority of the Zero interceptors, the Japanese did not lose a single aircraft, while the Americans had no fewer than 17 Wildcats and Breaster Buffaloes shot down. Once the enemy fighters were eliminated, the Japanese bombed and strafed the installations as well as the nearby sand islet, destroying several buildings, gasoline depots, seaplane hangars, observation turrets, vehicles, and anti-aircraft artillery positions during the process, and killing numerous base employees and Marines. However, ground-based machine guns shot down 5 aircraft, 2 Zeros, 2 Aichi Vals, and 1 Nakajima B-5N. Curiously, film director John Ford was filming in the middle of the raid. Despite being wounded by shrapnel in the back, he was fortunate to capture footage of the engagement that he later released in a documentary titled The Battle of Midway. The bombing of Midway Atoll resulted in 23 American planes destroyed, compared to only 6 Japanese aircraft shot down. 1 in the air, and the rest by the fire of the Marine Corps' anti-aircraft batteries. However, the damage inflicted on the island was less than expected, as some facilities remained standing, and half of the runways were barely affected. Therefore, Officer Joichi Tominaga, in a somewhat hasty decision, radioed Nagumo the following message: "Another attack wave is needed." Mistakes. Officer Joichi Tominaga's message to the command bridge of the aircraft carrier. Akagi completely confused. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who, still unaware of the presence of enemy aircraft carriers in the area, hesitated for several minutes while a discussion started among the staff officers. Among those favoring a second raid was his closest advisor, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka. However, his operations chief, Minoru Genda, preferred caution, especially considering the runways needed to recover the squadrons returning from the island. In the end, Nagumo chose a middle course, clearing the flight decks for the first wave's landing, while simultaneously lowering bombers via elevators to replace their torpedoes with bombs. This was a very risky task, because the rearming process required folding the wings of each plane to save space in the hangar, while heavy carts transported bombs and torpedoes back and forth, consuming valuable time and nullifying the capacity to respond quickly in an emergency. The 16th and 17th United States Fleet Task Forces also experienced an initial stage of confusion at the start of the Battle of Midway. Unsure of the exact nature of the enemy, at 7:02 in the morning, they launched 116 carrier-based planes, including 67 Dauntless SBD dive bombers, 29 Devastator torpedo bombers, and 20 Wildcat escort fighters. Their objective was to reach the sighting point given by the PBY Catalina reconnaissance seaplane, but during the flight, the Americans were intercepted by Zero fighters, and many were shot down, while half ran out of fuel and had to abort the mission by making emergency landings on Midway Atoll. In fact, from the island itself, a squadron of 10 planes, 6 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers took off. But shortly after overflying the combined fleet at around 7:10, they were ambushed by a patrol of 29 Japanese interceptors, resulting in the total loss of those aircraft with no survivors. At 7:28 in the morning, the Mitsubishi F-1M seaplane that had taken off half an hour late from the cruiser Tone, after covering about 200 nautical miles in its grid, discovered the trail of ships belonging to the 17th Task Force. The message transmitted to the Akagi command bridge was, "Sighted 10 ships, apparently enemy, at 10 degrees elevation and 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Upon hearing this, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo panicked and immediately ordered all work below the decks of his carriers to be suspended, awaiting more precise information as he radioed the seaplane pilot with the following order: confirm contact and identify possible aircraft carriers. Just at 8 o'clock, the only group of 16 Douglas Dauntless SBD dive bombers that had not become lost during the search for the combined fleet found the rear formation of the squadron and immediately launched an attack on the aircraft carrier, Hiryu. Unfortunately for the inexperienced Americans, the carrier-based fighters were on alert, as were the nearby destroyers' batteries, which shot down 8 of the American planes and drove off the other 8, with only one Japanese Zero. Interceptor lost during the engagement. A few minutes later, around 8:20, 14 heavy B-17 bombers flew over the Japanese squadron and dropped their bombs from an altitude of 6,100 meters. But all the devices missed because the ships avoided them by circling. 4 minutes after the B-17 attack, at 8:24, the combined fleet received a new report from the reconnaissance seaplane of the cruiser Tone, whose pilot informed, "Enemy group accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier in a rear position. 2 other ships discovered, probably cruisers, 200 miles, 8 degrees from Midway, heading 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. As a result of this very relevant new information, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had long since lost his composure and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, had to order for the second time that bombs be swapped for torpedoes at a frantic pace. However, amid the chaos, a new counterorder was soon issued because at that exact moment, the planes that had just bombed Midway began to arrive, requiring the flight decks to be cleared to accommodate and refuel the aircraft again. Thus, all personnel on the ship, including mechanics, pilots, and sailors, were mobilized to speed up the process, lowering and raising planes to and from the hangars, attaching torpedoes to the bellies of the Nakajima B-5N, and piling bombs in one corner of the storage area. They were not moved to their safety depots to save time, increasing the risk of explosion, since if one detonated, it could trigger a chain reaction. At the same time that disorder reigned on the combined fleet, the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had just spotted the Japanese squadron through its periscope, fired 2 torpedoes at the battleship Kirishima, which missed. Later, it repeated the action with 2 torpedoes against the cruiser Nagara, which also missed, and the submarine was forced to flee the area after alerting the nearby destroyer Arashi. Similarly, at 8:27, the Japanese ships suffered a new air attack by 11 Vindicator dive bombers from Midway Atoll, which missed all their bombs against the battleship Haruna, resulting in 4 American planes being shot down. Sinking of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. As the morning of June 4th, 1942, progressed, the 16th and 17th Task Forces again launched all the planes they had in their hangars, which, without maintaining order and in staggered waves, took off from the decks of the 3 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. This improvisation caused many squadrons to reach the combined fleet at very different times, not to mention that 10 Wildcat fighters became lost after mistakenly deviating 280 kilometers from their course, forcing them to ditch in the ocean with the consequent death of 2 pilots. At 9:30 in the morning, a squadron of 10 Devastator torpedo bombers, led by Officer John Waldron, flew over the Japanese combined fleet, while the carriers were raising their aircraft from the hangar elevators to the decks. Although the Japanese were in a very vulnerable situation, as soon as they headed toward the target, they were ambushed by Zero fighters and shredded by anti-aircraft batteries from both the carriers and escorting destroyers. The result was tragic, as all 10 Devastators were shot down before releasing their torpedoes, with all pilots killed except one, Officer George Gay, who floated in the water holding onto a piece of his plane's wing, from where he inflated a rubber raft and sheltered inside it to witness the historic event about to take place. 5 minutes after the first torpedo bomber attack on the combined fleet, at 9:35, 2 more squadrons appeared, totaling 43 planes. Among them were 14 Devastator torpedo bombers, led by Officer Eugene Lindsay from USS Enterprise, followed somewhat behind by 12 more Devastators and 17 Dauntless SBD dive bombers from USS Yorktown. Although this swarm coordinated to try to divide the 27 Zero escort fighters, the bombs and torpedoes failed against the aircraft carrier Soryu, and 10 American planes were shot down without the Japanese suffering a single loss. At 10:20 in the morning on June 4th, the 4 aircraft carriers of the Japanese combined fleet finally finished positioning their planes on the decks or in the elevators, most loaded with gasoline and armed with torpedoes and bombs, ready to take off toward the area where the 17th Task Force had been spotted. Thus, just at the moment when Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gave the launch signal and the first Japanese fighter began to taxi on the runway, suddenly a sentinel shouted the following alert: "Dive bombers!" Immediately, a squadron of dauntless SBDs dove from the sky toward a target that could barely maneuver, since the ships were steaming full ahead into the wind to take off their planes. And on top of that, with highly explosive material on the decks, the Kaga was the first target of the dauntless SBD dive bombers. After descending amid the intense anti-aircraft fire of the ship, which shot down one of the planes, they dropped several 454-kilogram bombs, 5 of which hit the carrier directly around 10:22. The first caused damage to the elevator, the second detonated in the crew quarters, the third vaporized a couple of Zero fighters on the flight deck. The fourth exploded on the island, killing several officers and Captain Jisaku Okada, and the fifth killed 269 mechanics in the hangars. The 6 chain explosions that soon rocked the ship due to the bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the storage areas quickly set its structure on fire and led to the order to abandon ship, including the portrait of Emperor Hirohito, which was taken aboard the destroyer Hagekaze. Unfortunately, many sailors and technicians were trapped in the lower levels, and the carrier finally sank, dragging 814 crew members with it. The Soryu was the second target of 13 dauntless SBD dive bombers, which at 10:25 hit it with 3 bombs dropped from 800 meters. One bomb set fire to the 127mm gun compartment. Another detonated in the lower hangar amid the Aichi Val dive bombers. And the last destroyed the storage areas of the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. The explosions were so violent that one of the Zero fighters taxiing on the flight deck lost control and crashed into the sea. Additionally, fuel pipes burst, boilers shut down after their crews died, and ventilation ducts exploded, releasing toxic gases that spread the fires and made the situation unbearable. In the face of this crisis, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered the evacuation of the ship, except for himself, deciding to die aboard. He ultimately drowned with his ship when the Soryu sank, taking with it the lives of 718 crew members. The Akagi was the last aircraft carrier attacked at 10:27 by 3 dauntless SBD dive bombers led by Lieutenant Richard Best. They only managed to hit it with one 454-kilogram bomb, which pierced the hangar and detonated among the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers loaded with fuel and carrying a torpedo under each fuselage. Unfortunately, the impact was deadly. Many planes collided on the flight deck, and their pilots were crushed in the cockpits while burning gasoline flooded the deck, scorching the hull and burning dozens of crew members. Although the teams did everything possible to save the ship, whose steering was damaged as it began circling, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo lost his composure again and attempted to commit suicide by the ritual of seppuku, something he ultimately did not carry out because Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka stopped him. Once the commander regained his reason and analyzed the situation more calmly, he finally ordered the evacuation of the ship. Beforehand, all the officers abandoned the island using an improvised rope tied to other ships to avoid the flames, which did not prevent Officer Mitsuo Fuchida from breaking his leg with a jump, leaving him unable to fly. Fortunately, most of the crew managed to board the destroyers, including Nagumo and the general staff, who transferred the command flag to the cruiser Nagara. Immediately afterward, the destroyers Arashi, Hagikaze, Miyakaze, and Nowaki fired several torpedoes at the Akagi to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, sinking the ship with a total of 267 sailors killed. The Hiryu, closing the formation of the Kido Butai, was also attacked by 10 Devastator torpedo bombers, but they failed because all were shot down by a squadron of 10 Zero fighters. With the American raid on the combined fleet complete, the outcome for Japan could not have been more discouraging. If at 10:22 in the morning, the Empire of the Rising Sun was winning the Second World War, at 10:28, it was suddenly losing it to the United States. That brief window of time that changed the course of history was later called the 5 Minutes of Midway by Officer Mitsuo Fuchida. Sinking of the USS Yorktown and the Hiryu. Immediately after the sinking of the 3 carriers, Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi, the surviving planes from the attack landed on the flight deck of the USS Yorktown, and their pilots quickly informed Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher that the Hiryu was still intact. Although the Americans launched several Wildcat fighters to search for it, the Japanese carrier under Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who had disobeyed Nagumo's order to switch torpedoes for bombs and thus had time to launch his planes without risk, had just sent a squadron of 24 planes, including 6 Zero interceptors and 18 Aichi Val dive bombers, toward grid number 17 of the 17th Task Force. At 11:55 in the morning on June 4th, the Japanese planes from the Hiryu, led by Flight Officer Michio Kobayashi, overflew the U.S. fleet and engaged in a duel against Wildcat fighters and the escorting destroyers' anti-aircraft batteries, which shot down 10 Aichi Val dive bombers. Unfortunately for the Americans, 6 of the planes evaded the USS Yorktown's anti-aircraft fire, and 3 managed to hit it with 242-kilogram bombs, causing the following damage. The first destroyed the hangar, the second set the funnel on fire, and the third broke the ammunition magazine. Although the damage was not yet critical, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher transferred his general staff to the cruiser USS Astoria. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a second wave from the Hiryu appeared with 16 planes, 6 Zero fighters, and 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. Despite losing 5 planes to the ship's side guns, they scored 2 torpedo hits on the port side that caused the ship to list about 26 degrees. Shortly after several tons of water entered, one horizontal bomber hit by machine gun fire lost control and crashed into the bridge, piercing the deck and breaking the boiler ventilation ducts, leaving the carrier mortally wounded, with a toll of 141 crew members killed. The inevitable loss of the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier was soon avenged when at 2:20 in the afternoon, the 16th Task Force, which had just located the Hiryu, launched the last 26 available Dauntless SBD dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet aircraft carriers. Similarly, at 3:30 in the afternoon, one of the seaplanes from the cruiser Tone also spotted the presence of the two carriers of the 16th Task Force, something confirmed by an interrogated prisoner. But by then, it was too late because very few planes remained available, and the enemy carrier aviation was only 30 kilometers away. At 5:01 in the afternoon on June 4th, the Dauntless SBD dive bombers, led by Lieutenant William Gallagher, attacked the Hiryu, which barely had time to defend itself as it was hit by 4 bombs, one dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, who had previously sunk the Kaga. The explosions were so massive that the flight deck collapsed on itself, crushing 19 Zero fighters and killing all the pilots trapped in their cockpits before the ship suffered several internal explosions that made salvation impossible. Despite efforts to regain control of the ship throughout the night, at 2:30 in the early morning of the 5th, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi gathered the 800 crew members on deck to give them a speech and lower the rising sun flag, then ordered them to abandon the ship and announced that he would stay on board with Captain Tomeo Kaku, as both decided to take their own lives following the Bushido Code. Curiously, Yamaguchi was of samurai origin. Thus, at dawn, the destroyers Kazagumo and Makigumo fired a pair of torpedoes at the Hiryu, which sank with 385 souls aboard, although 34 survivors managed to survive adrift for 14 days until rescued by U.S. fleet vessels. Sinking of the Mikuma and the USS Haman. 24 hours after the disaster suffered in the Battle of Midway, on June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato, could hardly believe the news sent by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Despite the defeat being obvious, the main body's ignorance of the situation was so great that they chose to continue with Operation MI, and at least take something positive from it by occupying Midway Island, from where they supposedly could hunt the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. At dawn on June 5, 1942, the 4 Japanese cruisers Mogami, Mikuma, Suzuya, and Kumano, located 90 kilometers from Midway Atoll, approached the island and bombarded it with their large-caliber guns, causing minor material damage and putting the base on alert. In fact, the coastal batteries fired several unsuccessful salvos, and the island's aviation launched 20 planes, 12 Dauntless SBD dive bombers, and 8 B-17 bombers, which missed all their bombs on the Japanese ships. Unfortunately, during one of the evasive maneuvers, the cruiser Mogami collided with the Mikuma, forcing the latter to reduce speed significantly until it was caught by 2 waves from the USS Enterprise carrier, which had just sent 34 planes, 31 Dauntless SBDs, and 3 Devastator torpedo bombers. The attackers managed to hit with no less than 5 bombs, one of which was fatal in the central torpedo room, causing a massive explosion and the sinking of the Mikuma, which disappeared beneath the water with 700 crew members. The aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, which on June 5th remained adrift amid the formation of the 17th Task Force, was boarded by a salvage party of 170 technicians who tried to save the ship. Miraculously, they managed to correct part of the list and attach it to the towing cables of the USS Vireo, and later to those of the destroyer USS Hamon. Unfortunately for the Americans, the Japanese submarine I-168, under the command of Captain Yahachi Tanabe, soon appeared in the area and fired a torpedo that struck and split the USS Hamon in two. The destroyer sank immediately with 80 crew members aboard, but the worst part was that it dragged the steel cable connected to the USS Yorktown, which also disappeared forever in the deep waters of the Pacific Ocean. At nightfall on June 5, 1942, the remnants of the combined fleet began their retreat to Japan, with only 3 of the 7 aircraft carriers that had sailed from the archipelago just over 2 weeks earlier. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aware of the magnitude of the defeat and deeply saddened by the destruction of half of the Kido Butai, stated before the other members of the battleship Yamato's general staff, "I am the only one who must apologize to the Emperor.